In this module, we discuss the different types of plant and crop production systems as organic, conventional, and both small and large-scale farming systems. As you watch this module, begin thinking about the ways different types of crop production systems are similar to and different from one another. Also consider how the different crop production systems help us move toward a more sustainable future.
I think that, organic is technically a certification that is given out by the USDA, and it basically, I think the ethos of organic growers and the people that, and there's actually a lot of the old school organic growers that kind of started the movement in the 70s and 80s who are interested in kind of promoting that original ethos that kind of came in, where that label came from to a large extent. But organic basically means that you cannot use certain products on the things that you grow. You cannot do certain practices, and you are required to take records to show what you've grown, how you've done it, what products you've used on that. And it also involves some amount of like food safety concerns. Things like if you're using composted manure, how long that was cured before it was applied, things like that. So organic is kind of often tied to people that are thinking about sustainability and how they grow things, but not necessarily, I think. And I think that, as it's kind of become more integrated into the industrialized food system, there are organic products that are being grown that may have similar impacts on the environment to some conventional growers. So, it just kind of is a different set of tools. And I think the original organic growers, to a large degree, were interested in, producing food that had less inputs and less things sprayed on it and less fertilizers, and trying to use more biological systems as a way to kind of continue their farming fertility and things like that. But yeah, it is not like inherently a one-to-one that organic is necessarily sustainable. That concept is largely around thinking about how to use pesticides as a last resort, essentially. So you're trying to use other cultural methods as ways to manage insects and diseases on your farm. So for us, that might be using row covers to keep pests outside from getting to our crops, or it might mean that we accept a little bit more wholly arugula than we might otherwise, or things like that. But there are times when we, and then also to a certain extent, we're trying to think about if we are going to spray, how do we do it the least number of times on that crop possible? So we might accept a little bit more loss and wait for the full flush of that particular pest to hatch before we spray, and so that we will have to spray less, ideally. So we're trying to just minimize the amount of spraying we can possibly do. And then when it comes to disease, we're basically using we're only using cultural practices to prevent and manage disease. And so that's like trellising properly, pruning properly, making sure spacing happens and weeding happens so there's good airflow around your plants, things like that. On the insect pressure side and the disease pressure side, I'm not sure if it's a ton more labor in of itself, but you might have less yield per amount of labor, just because you may not have quite as much yield per square foot or something like that. And for us, weeds are the main thing that really impact our yields to a large degree. So we definitely have some pests that we deal with, but to a large degree, we can get away with not doing too much spraying and still get decent yields for a large degree. And there are certain crops like cucumbers and summer squash, zucchinis, things like that, that we do multiple plantings and just accept that, that planting is going to die. And so we're going to rely on that next planting because the pests will eventually take them out, and unless you were to spray them.
When we talk about sustainable agriculture, a lot of people, you mentioned organic agriculture, and many people sort of use sustainable to mean organic and think that they're one and the same. Can you talk a little bit more about how those are different, similar and different?
Yeah. Well, I would say that both have the goal of balancing productivity, profitability, and environmental health. But I think one of the things that frankly has frustrated me with organics is because there are such high barriers to entry and it's so stringent. The overall organic acreage has remained very low over time. We're still at less than 2% in Illinois for organic acreage. And the fact is we need to make a lot more progress on a lot more acres. So by taking a broader definition of sustainability, and I believe through regenerative ag is a good approach, and taking a look at the metrics that we want to affect, I think we need to find ways of enrolling more acres in these approaches and thinking about the impact versus area trade-off. So in an organic system, you might have an enormous amount of impact, but on an acre or two. In a farm that begins to adopt, a large-scale commercial farm that begins to adopt, let's say, just winter cover crops, or maybe adding another crop into the system, it might be an incremental change, but because it's multiplied by the many acres that it's implemented on, it can have a large overall impact too. And I don't want to discount those types of impacts.
Okay. So by that definition, regenerative agriculture in some ways would be more inclusive?
Regenerative ag pitches a big tent. Okay. Yeah, it invites a lot of different types of producers in to contribute in the way that they're able to. And so rather than have it follow a strict orthodoxy and say, no, you can't be part of the regenerative ag tent because you do this, rather it's, are you making progress? We have a lot of progress to make. We have a lot of acres. And in order to help growers become part of that positive movement, we also need to provide the support for that. And so diversified value chains are a very important part of that support. Right now, we're really just set up to accept a couple of narrow commodities. And for growers who are trying to create this diverse portfolio of crops and products, they often do so at personal financial risk, or they have just amazing marketing skills. And the people who are willing to do those two things are fairly rare. So we need to make it easier for more people to be part of that.
Some farmers believe that the best way to manage land is to do no-till, put in cover crops, and keep the soil as covered as possible with no-till. Here's the key to that. You have to be using pesticides to make that work. If you don't have pesticides, no-till cover crops don't work because you can't kill it. There's one. The other extreme of that is organic, which uses no pesticides, no synthetic fertilizers, nothing of that nature. Both sides believe that they're doing what's right by the soil. This side uses no pesticides, but they have to use a lot of tillage. All right? So here's two dramatically different feel for what's environmentally friendly. Keeping the soil covered or not using pesticides. In which case you're using tillage, which means you're exposing the soil more than this person to bare soil. You have more soil erosion.
Conventional agricultural systems tend to be scalable. So they're producing large amounts of food, whether that's a grain or an animal product or something like that. And I tell my class that is, think feeding cities, right? Think enough to feed a city. And then we see more alternative or niche-based, which tend to not be at the same scale, and tend to have a focus on something, whether that's a focus on either enhanced nutrition or enhanced animal welfare or some special niche that a group of people values, but tends to not think feeding a city, think feeding a suburb or feeding a small town. And then we still have, what I grew up with was kind of feeding our neighbors.
Okay.
And so at those different scales, we can prioritize different pieces of the system. So the conventional systems, or those that are at the highest scale, are usually prioritizing availability. And so they're thinking about, often the restraint is economic availability. So they're feeding the most at risk of our population, those who can't afford the niche products, those that don't have a neighbor nearby, so they're feeding a different group of our population. And they're ensuring that there is enough food available at a cost that people can afford with enough nutrition. So it's kind of meeting those needs. And then the other niche, they tend to focus on some value priority of another different group of people.
So talk about some of those. Like what might some of those be?
So some of the niche
Yeah,
products.
uh-huh.
Yeah. So if you go into the grocery store and you look at labels on products, there are I can't count how many different potential labels of enhancement. So you might see the buzzword sustainability on a label, and in a perfect world, you can go and understand that label because they'll have a prescription of all the things that they do that make them more sustainable than some other. Often those are related to social issues and sometimes environmental issues as well. So they may do some process that uses less water or is more energy efficient or better use of resources. You might even see some animal welfare-based labels out there where they do something different with their animals, whether that's more space or outdoor access, or they don't do some process that another farm might do. And again, some of it is based in science, some of it is based in a factual piece of there could be a benefit to that practice, and some of it is based in marketing. That's the real tricky part. That's the part where it kind of, it takes a little more digging to better understand why is that better, and is that really better?
This interview is discussing crop management practices such as the use of pesticides, cover crops, and different types of tillage practices. Across the range of crop management considerations, we can identify specific decision points with pros and cons relative to the economic, social, and environmental pillars of sustainability. Interwoven in these decisions is also the question of scale. How much food are we producing, for whom, at what cost, and what price? And how do we meet that demand?
So I want to go back to something that you said about small scale systems being romanticized. Are those possible in modern day agriculture?
Sure, they're possible. I think the question of the objective and what you call a farm is not actually that simple of a question, though. So USDA's definition of a farm, for example, is based on the value of production or expected production in a normal year. What we do when we drive down the road and think, well, that's a farm, may or may not be a farm at all, right? It may be owned by somebody 300 miles away. So I think getting a very clear, specific definition is important. Small scales, quite often specialized or unique with the ability to grow one particular thing really well, or serve agritourism, or be a source of a relief of a pinch point in the supply system. Those all exist. But in the part of the country where we're sitting, on some of the most productive farmland in the world, scale does also matter for the cost of producing broadly consumed commodities. So corn, soybeans, wheat, things we think of as the basic big three commodities in particular. A small scale operator would have a hard time competing for against the economics of larger scale production. But if you want to produce specialized goat cheese, for example, a very large operation may not be able to do something quite as nimbly or specific as that.
When thinking about some of the terms discussed in this module, scale, niche markets, consumer demand, pricing and availability of food products, there's a lot to consider. When we think about the grand challenges of feeding the world through the lens of sustainability, we're faced with some tough decisions and hard considerations. How do we produce enough safe, nutritious, and affordable food for the people within our local communities while also meeting global food needs and protecting the environment?